It is Tim once again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome your faces to another episode of Cocktails and Curiosities. I am your host, Axel, and I will be joined shortly by my co-host. Oh, hold on. Ooh. Alright, false alarm. We're good. But, yeah, we will be joined here shortly by my co-host, good old Knox. Gonna give a second to get our intro rolling. If you were not here last week or here for the previous episodes, this is episode 4 of Cocktails and Curiosities. This is, it's a podcast. It's a podcast that me and my roommate Knox have thrown together. We kind of just talk about random stuff that we find interesting and cool. And, we just kind of shoot the shit for an hour. Of course, if you have any comments, concerns, or questions, feel free to poke us in the chat. We are more than welcome to answer any and all questions you may or may not have. We may have something interesting that pops up that you want to ask us a question about. More than welcome to. So, yeah. I'm going to go ahead and get Knox in here, and we will get started. If he will join the call. Come on, Knox. 8 o'clock. Go. Come on, Knox. There he is.
There we go. I was
Hello,
waiting on a
Knox.
phone call, or I was waiting on the call, and then I didn't realize that my Discord wasn't on or open, so I couldn't receive it in the first place. So I'm dumb.
Fair.
Hi.
Hello.
Excuse me.
Well, I went ahead and gave everybody the intro for this week. We're apparently going to be talking about hyper objects.
Yeah. So it's a concept that I recently came across. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that a hyper object is not a hyper-dimensional object. Those are two different things. That's the first thing I'm going to say about this.
Okay.
A hyperobject is more like an abstraction of a certain concept than it is an actual physical object. So, the way I always explained it is that the example I was given was climate change and our impact on the environment. And basically how it explained was that because of the complexity and how widespread of an issue this is, it's considered a hyper object. It's so massively difficult to pin down that it's given this title. And
it's more like so you're saying it's more like a concept than it is like a physical item?
Yeah, no, yeah. So so oh god, sorry, I was like just in the middle of playing Metal Gear, and I was very focused on completing this mission. It was one of those perfect stealth ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I had literally everything done except there was one enemy left, and then he spotted me in the most bullshit way, and I'm very upset about that. Like, just literally right before this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little out of it because of that. But the Yeah, so hyperobjects are not specifically a like physical object. That's why I say it's not like a hyperdimensional object, because a hyperdimensional object implies that it's an object that exists in higher dimensions than a normal one, which is basically the definition of that.
Yeah, so like
However,
the example I found was like um things like a styrofoam. It's not like a styrofoam cup or two, but all the styrofoam on Earth ever. Like apparently that's a concept of a hyper object because it's going to last like 500 years. Apparently that's like an example. It's not a specific item, but it's the concept of an item or
so here's
an
the
idea.
actual definition. Here's the actual definition. The definition of hyperobject is as follows. Hyperobjects are objects which have a vitality to them, but you can't touch them, like race or class or climate change. Their effects may be experienced, even if they cannot be necessarily touched. The example is ethics itself is revealed to be a hyperobject, a massive, tangled chain of objects lampooning one another through weird relation, mistaking their own essence for that of the alien object they encounter, exploding the very idea of ethics to infinity. And their traits are viscous. Hyperobjects adhere to any other object they touch, no matter how hard an object tries to resist. In this way, hyperobjects overrule ironic distance, meaning that the more an object tries to resist a hyperobject, the more glued to the hyperobject it becomes. Molten hyperobjects are so massive that they refute the idea that space-time is fixed, concrete, and consistent. They're non-local. Hyperobjects are massively distributed in time and space to the extent that their totality cannot be realized in any particular local manifestation. For example, global warming is a hyperobject that impacts meteorological conditions, such as tornado formations. According to Morton, though, objects don't feel global warming, but instead experience tornadoes as they cause damage in specific places. Thus, non-locality describes the manner in which a hyperobject becomes more substantial than the local manifestations they produce. Phased hyperobjects occur a higher dimensional space than
Hyperobjects
other
occupy.
can normally perceive. So they are higher, essentially considered higher dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So hyperobjects occupy. That's what it is. For some reason I kept reading.
Yeah, I'm actually reading the same. I'm reading the same thing you are at the moment.
Yeah. So phase hyperobjects occupy a higher dimensional space than other entities can normally perceive. Thus, hyperobjects appear to come and go in three-dimensional space, but would appear differently to an observer in a higher dimensional view. Interobjective hyperobjects are formed by relations between more than one object. Consequently, objects are only able to perceive the imprint or footprint of a hyperobject upon other objects, revealed as information. For example, global warming is formed by interactions between the sun, fossil fuels, and carbon dioxide, among other objects. Yet global warming is more apparent through emission levels, temperature changes, and ocean levels, making it seem as if global warming is a product of scientific models rather than the object that created its own measurement. In addition, blah, blah, blah defines a hyperobject as something that can be in more than one place at once. And adds the internet to the list of hyperobjects.
I can see that. Okay.
So this is what I wanted to talk about today. This is a start on a really long-winded series that was spurred by one Vsauce video, which I
think I actually watched.
Yeah, it is the name of the Vsauce video for reference for anyone who understands what started my entry in this topic. Is the future of reasoning is what the video was called, and I would greatly implore anyone who watches this to go watch that first. Go watch that, and this will all make a lot more sense because I'm going to be using that as my basis for a lot of these discussion points. That and this specific, what is this, cyborg anthropology?
Yeah.
Wikipedia. I don't know. But it's where I'm getting the definitions for hyperobjects. So we used to just conceptualize multidimensional objects, but according to this definition, the higher dimensional objects that we would be running into are actually things that we would consider more like high abstract concepts than they are anything else.
Yeah, concepts that have multiple facets that aren't nailed down to one specific idea.
Well, no, these are specific ideas. It's just I think non-local is probably the most important one of these, which is hyperobjects are massively distributed in time and space to the extent that their totality cannot be realized in any particular local manifestation. I think that's the key classifier. If something has everything else but not that, I don't think it can be considered a hyperobject. I think it has to have the non-local to be a hyperobject. Does that make sense? You're silent right now, and that's worrying.
Oh, whoops! I legit accidentally pressed the mute button.
I was like,
I was moving my mic to kind of get it back into place. But yeah, from what I understand, like, you know, non-local is probably the most like important part of that, because the hyperobject can kind of melt into like whatever concept you're trying to talk about. Like, you could go into one topic and then transition into another, but that hyperobject would still apply.
Yeah, I think the two things are viscous and non-local are the more important ones, because they essentially imply that whatever a hyperobject is depends on, what we're talking about. But any hyperobject is going to be some kind of concept or idea that interacts with reality, that is something that is around in places, and it's going to be around for a extended period of time while being also in multiple places at once. And whenever it comes into play, in other words, whenever another object touches it, so in other words, another concept is related to it, is what I'm getting out of that.
Okay.
Is adhered to it. Is it cannot resist that concept and is now going to be consistently intertwined. Like, for example, ethics is one of the examples they gave, but let's say ethics and morality. Morality is not ethics, but morality is worked into ethics so much that it's unable to remove itself. When you talk about morality, you basically talk about ethics. One is basically stuck inside the other. But there are other concepts that are related to morality that are also stuck to ethics just as much as morality is. Morality can be its own hyperobject too. Because think about morality being connected to religion, governments, economic systems, society, institutions, all of those different concepts that are not ethics or morality having to be intertangled with that. And the amount of times that ethics pops up in places that it's not a place about ethics, but you still have to worry about ethics being so pervasive and being everywhere that it's considered a hyperobject.
Yeah, from what I'm reading right now from something by it's called Ontology by Bryant. Apparently, from Bryant's perspective, reality is accessible to human knowledge because it's structured by human cognition and limits philosophy to a self-reflexive analysis and mechanisms through intuitions through cognitive structured realities. Basically, anything that we can perceive.
Can you send me that link?
Yeah.
So I can read what the hell you just said. You said that way too fast. If you're gonna say something like that, you gotta slow down, because no one's gonna understand what you just said. But I'll say it, and I'll break it down a little. Just send me the link.
I'm sending it. I could have just reset it. Rude.
No.
But
Because I like me as a person am going to need to read it either way.
Yeah.
Alien phen- phenomenology. Phenomenology. There we go. Thanks, brain. Alien
Yes.
phenomenology, which is where this all comes from, is Timothy Morton.
Yeah.
And now, where is this thing?
It was ontology, Bryant
Ontology, Bryant. Yes. Okay.
expansion.
Expansion.
Basically, the means in which hyperobjects pretty much expand.
Oh, okay. I'm looking for that. First, second, third, or fourth paragraph in that section.
I read the first section of this whole spiel. Basically,
There it is. I see. So, German idealism was oh, Immanuel Kant. Okay. So it's I forget Kant's fucking thing. Ah, that bullshit. So basically, it opposes human egocentrism, which is what anthropocentrism blah is basically humans are the most important thing in the universe, which is a very like Christian thought.
yeah.
Not to be like anti-religious here because whatever, but because there's also non-Christian people that can think this, but humans from a scientific perspective are not the most important thing. From a Christian perspective, are so generally that comes up. So Levi Brand. I can't speak today. Apparently, I speak for a living. I'm just kidding. I don't get paid for this. I do this for fun. So Bryant opposes post-Kantian, yeah, and philosophies of access. From Bryant's perspective, the Kantian contention that reality is accessible to human knowledge because it is structured by human cognition limits philosophy to a self-reflexive analysis of mechanisms and institutions through which cognition structures reality. So basically, Kant said that essentially gave the very. Axel, you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening to you right now.
Okay. I just
You're reading. I'm not gonna butt in while you're reading.
Okay. So what I get from this, and you can correct me not correct me, but you can give your spin on this if you think otherwise. But essentially, I know Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's. I'm trying to remember exactly what his most important philosophies were. So I'm very big into philosophy. But essentially, what they're referring to is one of his specific things, which is that that reality is accessible to human knowledge. Essentially, we can understand reality. While say someone, for example, who's a big person who says this is Neil deGrasse Tyson. Actually, one of his big things is what if humans are not smart enough to ever comprehend reality? Like, what if it's impossible for a human to comprehend reality? Which is the opposite of this thing. Basically, what if science is an uphill battle in the sense of I forget his name, the guy who rolls a stone uphill just for it to get to the top of the hill and roll back down. Essentially, there's no way for us to ever understand reality. That's the two opposing things here. Kantian essentially says that reality is accessible to human knowledge because it's structured by human cognition. And from Bryant's perspective, that limits philosophy to a self-reflective analysis of the mechanisms and institutions through which cognition structures reality. In other words, by saying that human knowledge is accessible because it is structured by human cognition, makes it so that all you ever spend doing is looking at how cognition structures reality. So doing things like considering about, I guess the best example of this would be the whole idea of like we could be looking at like an orange t-shirt, but my orange could be what you would call green. That's like a looking at the how cognition structures reality. That would be an example of that.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And it lowers philosophical investigation to the interrogation of a single relation, the human world gap, which is what I just referred to. Is the gap between a human's perception and what the world could actually be.
Yeah, to my understanding, or at least the spin I would take off of that is like, hey, on one side of the fence, you could say if humankind can perceive something, it can be understood and cataloged. However, the other end of the spectrum says, oh, hey, we're never going to reach that. We're just we don't simply do not have enough either information or mental capacity to understand what reality actually is, regardless of purpose.
Your audio is fucking up here.
Is it
very staticky?
Here, I got you. Hold on.
Yeah, it sounds horrible.
Better?
That's better. Yes.
Okay.
So much better.
I'm
hurt when you speak.
I'm sorry. It probably could be heard through the stream as well. I apologize.
Yeah.
But I'll go ahead and repeat that just for like continuity's sake. So
yeah, please.
From what I understand and from what I gather from this, on one side of the fence, they're pretty much saying, hey, human beings can perceive X, Y, and Z, therefore we can identify, catalog, and understand reality. There's one side of the fence, like, right there. Then you have the other side of the fence, who's just like, human beings are either not built, not smart enough, or just are simply incapable of understanding what reality actually is. We're pretty much just spinning our wheels.
That's the two sides of this argument. And I don't know how this has to do with fucking... I should read on, shouldn't I guess.
Well, so from what I'm gathering is pretty much this is a setup for Timothy Morton's like hyper object theory.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is that I don't understand how this relates to hyper objects, so I'm reading ahead.
Gotcha.
It's obvious that this is supposed to relate to it, but okay, here it is. To counter the form of post-Kantian epistemology, which epistemology is essentially the study of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you find the trueness of reality? That's epistemology. Bryant articulates an object-oriented philosophy called ontology, grounded in 3 principles. First, the ontic principle states that there is no difference that does not make a difference. Following from the premise that questions of difference precede epistemological who cares? Precede truth-finding interrogations that to be is to create differences. This principle posts that knowledge cannot be fixed prior to the engagement with difference. So essentially, things have to be different before there can be anything, which I'm fine with this. Basically, if there's no difference, then there is nothing.
Difference is basically necessary for reality.
Yeah, and it's necessary before you can even go looking for truth, because if there is no difference, there is no truth.
Gotcha.
And so for Bryant, the thesis that there is a thing in its... that's what Kant was famous for. He was famous for making the distinction between the world as a human sees it, and what he refers to as the world as in of itself, or in itself. Basically, the world that cannot be perceived because humans are a flawed focal point. However, Kant still believes that we can try and get there. We can get through, like, basically through philosophizing, we can get to the actual world as of itself, or whatever, or the thing in of itself.
Mhm.
Anyways, so for Bryant, the thesis, there is a thing in itself, which is Kant's theory, which we cannot know is untenable because it presupposes forms of being that make no difference. Essentially, if there's a thing of itself that we can't perceive, it doesn't matter. Basically, there's no point to it existing because it makes no difference. If it's there, like, what it is doesn't matter, because if we can't perceive it, then why care about it? It's the whole, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it ever make a sound? Like, doesn't matter.
Okay. I get what you're saying.
It's a bit difficult of a concept for me to explain, but I understand it kind of in a roundabout way. Similar concepts of difference predicated upon negation, that which objects are not or lack when placed in comparison with another, are dismissed as arising only from the perspective of consciousness rather than an ontological difference that affirms independent being. Essentially, saying that, like, if you have a cube, saying that it lacks roundness is dismissed because that only exists from the perspective of your own consciousness. Knowing that round things exist and that this thing does not have the concept of, or does not have the aspect we would refer to as round, is pointless, because the object itself doesn't have a concept of roundness because it isn't round. So there's no point in stating that it does not have the concept of roundness. Does that make any sense?
I barely, and I doubt that anybody listening will understand that unless they are really into this shit.
I have a special brand of crazy. Let me try and explain it in a way that makes more sense. If something lacks a specific characteristic, such as a red t-shirt not being green, there is no point in when listing the aspects that object has, listing any differences that it doesn't, it is different from other objects, that it just doesn't have something. So,
basically, when making a list, you wouldn't put down this shirt is not green. You would simply state it is red.
Yes. So basically, in his form, in his concept of knowing things, and his concept of differences, stating that a red shirt is not green, there is no point to doing so. So you would never do it. You would only state that it is red, because saying that it is red is independent of knowledge and consciousness. However, saying that it is not green implies a presupposition that you know the difference between green and red, and that it is that compared to an object that is green, it is not green. So there's no point in doing
that. Okay.
It's gonna be a long episode.
Yeah, this is gonna be long. Strap in, people.
The principle of inhuman asserts that the concept of difference producing difference is not restricted to human, sociocultural, or epistemological domains. Hey, I finally fucking said that, although it was really forced.
That is a word right there.
Epistemological. There we go. Epistemological. Thereby marking the difference of the being of difference as independent of knowledge and consciousness. Humans exist as difference-making beings among other difference-making beings, therefore without holding any special positions with respect to other differences. Basically, this concept of differences, that is a red shirt, that is a green shirt, those two things are different, is independent of basically us being human. That's just something that is. It isn't something that, like, we're human.
It's
basically fact. The shirt isn't. Yeah, the shirt isn't red because we're human. The shirt is red because it is red.
It is a what is considered a factual statement with or without input.
Yes. Well, it is independent of knowledge and consciousness. So basically, I don't have to know what red is for that shirt to be red, and I don't have to be conscious of that shirt for it to still be red.
It'll be red regardless.
And the person wearing it will still get killed in that same episode.
Red shirts beware!
Yep. Third, the ontological principle maintains that there is no difference that does not also make a difference. Then the making of a difference is the minimum condition for the existence of being. In Bryant's word, if a difference is made, then the being is. So basically he's saying, if something... This is going to be a little bit abstract for me to explain this. If there is a gray piece of paper, like basically the exact middle between white and black.
Mm-hmm.
If I put a white dot and a black dot, pure white and pure black on there, those dots and that background now exist. If it is all just gray, nothing exists. But if I put a dot on there of a different color, that dot exists and the background exists because a difference is made between the dot and the background. And that difference makes those things exist. That's essentially what the third principle is. If a difference is made, the being is.
All right, I'm
basically
gonna ask you to wrap this section up. I need to redirect you.
Redirect me where?
Right back to hyperobjects.
But well, then I'll talk about this because now he's talking about the 4 different objects, and then that will lead us into hyperobjects.
Because the objects are an important concept to understand what kind of preface hyperobjects have on our reality.
Yeah, because from what I understand, the ontological Bryant's theory of objectism, or object-oriented philosophy, predates the hyperobject that is made by Morton, who essentially he expanded on the theory of objects by using this theory to make the hyperobject one. So, ontology distinguishes between 4 different types of objects: bright objects, dim objects, dark objects, and rogue objects. Bright objects are objects that strongly manifest themselves and heavily impact other objects, such as the ubiquity of cell phones and high-tech cultures. Dim objects lightly manifest themselves in an assemblage of objects. For example, a neutrino passing through solid matter without producing observable effects. Dark objects are objects that are so completely withdrawn that they produce no local manifestations and do not affect other objects. Rogue objects are not chained to any given assemblage of objects, but instead wander in and out of assemblages, modifying relations with the assemblages in which they enter. Political protesters exemplify rogue objects by breaking with the norms and relations of a dominant political assemblage in order to forge new relations that challenge change or cast off prior assemblage. Additionally, Brandt would propose the concept of wilderness ontology to explain the philosophical pluralization of agency away from human privilege.
Well, let me just go ahead and digest this for the other people at home, because that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. So, my understanding, you have bright objects. These are items that pretty much can and will affect other things around them. Cell phones are a great idea of that. That's a great way of putting that. Because cell phones both affect us as human beings, aka objects, and can affect the world around us, aka computers, cell phone towers, phone calls, yada yada yada.
Essentially, if I walked up to any person and said, "Do you know what a cell phone is?" they would say yes, most likely, as long as they're in a essentially they're ubiquitous. That's what makes them bright. In other words, anyone can know of them. However, if I went up to you and said, "Do you know what a walker gear is?" you would probably know.
You probably wouldn't know unless you've played the video games involved with that item.
Yeah. If I told you if I asked you, do you know what Metal Gear is? You'd probably, there'd be a lot of people in the world that would say no. However, there'd be a few people in the world that would say yes. I do want to know what that is, and I do know how it affects reality. That is a dim object. Dark objects are things that cannot be spoken of because they do not interact with anything, but they exist of their own. So that would most commonly be things like abstractions in your mental area, like your mind. And then there's rogue objects. Rogue objects just mean there's an element within some kind of group of objects that decides to work against that group of objects and no longer be a part of it to form new relations.
That being protesters or hell,
Protesters,
even countercultures are a pretty good idea of that
or
as well.
back to cell phones and concepts, a like in a capitalist society, the concept of communism would be a rogue object. In a uh, any maverick person is considered a rogue object
Mm-hmm.
because they don't follow most cultures. Shamans would be considered rogue objects. Heretics and criminals, those are all rogue objects because they work outside of the object that they exist within. The massive, what you might even call hyper object that they exist within, such as society or their government or their nation, they work against it, yet in tandem with that same object. Therefore, they are a rogue object.
This agent has gone rogue.
Yeah.
That's a very good way of putting it. An agent going rogue.
Well, yeah, but that's where the term that's basically because rogue is a word that means the same thing in both contexts.
Basically, it's
An
something
agent,
that goes against conform norms.
yes, whatever the normal state is, it goes against it while also simultaneously existing in whatever that group of objects that it's going against is. So, for example, if two countries are at war, those countries are technically not rogue objects of each other because they don't exist within each other. However, if a group within a country decides to run an independence movement and become independent from said country, that is a rogue element because it's within that country, therefore becoming a rogue object.
All right, so with those predetermined concept of objects proposed by Bryant, we then move into hyper objects, which is the theory proposed by Morton. Timothy Morton further building off of this object-oriented ontology.
Yeah. So, introduce the concept of hyperobjects to describe objects that are so massively distributed in time and space as to transcend spatio-temporal specificity. For those of you who don't know Latin or aren't very good with very fancy words, spatio is in space, temporal is in time. So, transcend a specified location in time and space. Such as global warming, styrofoam, and radioactive plutonium.
Yep.
He has subsequently enumerated 5 characteristics, which we already talked about: viscous, molten, non-local, phased, interobjective.
Yep.
And according to Morton, hyperobjects not only become visible during an age of economic crisis, but alert humans to ecological dilemmas defining the age in which they live in. Additionally, the existential capacity of hyperobjects to outlast a turn toward less materialistic cultural values, coupled with the threat many such objects pose towards organic matter, gives them a potential spiritual quality in which their treatment by future societies may become indistinguishable from reverential care. Basically, what I said there was, it shows you issues with ecological, economical issues. And its capacity essentially to outlast the turn towards less material cultural values. In other words, if we were less of fucking commodity fetishism, which I realized was um, mentioned down here. If we had less of an issue of that, then we would still be dealing with um, these hyper objects, even if we weren't materialistic. However, we still are, so we're still dealing with them. Like, say if we all became hippies and lived in the forest and in tune with nature, we still have to deal with plastic in the oceans because they're still there because we started it.
Yeah,
And
it's a human-made hyper object for that matter.
and then coupled with the threat many such objects pose towards organic matter, in other words, they they could kill us, like global warming, gives them a potential spiritual quality. I'm not explaining that, in which their treatment by future societies may become indistinguishable from reverent care. Think about it like if us stopping these hyper objects essentially was us stopping like a doomsday scenario. And so in the future, those could be perceived with reverence in a sense that like in a sense. So that like we could be there could be people I don't know, sacrificing goats to stop styrofoam. Like I know that sounds weird, but that's essentially what it's saying is that they could be calamities that in the future are given some kind of spiritual importance that because we stop them now. Or if they're still going on, could still be given spiritual importance.
Yeah, a lot of I'm actually like reading through the criticism with this kind of thought process in general, and
Yeah.
it one I'll read off one of like the actual like quotes that were said that could be said about this kind of thought process. Is it's let's see. Matthew David Siegel has argued that object-oriented philosophers should explore the theological and anthropological implications of their ideas in order to avoid slipping into nihilism of some speculative realists, where human values are a fluke in an uncaring and fundamentally entropic universe.
I disagree, but I understand why he says this. That's like someone who skimmed the very top of this conversation and was like, and I think the thing that's important there is the bit he says right before it, which is some commenters contend that object oriented ontology degrades meaning by placing humans and objects on equal footing. However, it doesn't. That's the main point of it, is that they're like, if you include hyper objects, not just objects,
Mm-hmm.
but if you include, I think I've actually like read on the ontology section and more things because when you read more into it, it does seem like he's putting humans because in most of the cases when he talks about objects, he actually talks about um hence the reference to protesters. He actually normally talks about things like people. He talks about how people are actually more like objects that interact with things. And it's a very difficult philosophy to understand. But the best way to my personal counter to that statement is that when you include hyper objects, it actually kind of makes it where some objects are on higher footing than humans. And because to fight a hyper object, you can't just be one person fighting it. A
It's
human can defeat an object, but a human cannot. One human cannot defeat a hyper object.
no, because
Humans
this
would have to. Hold on. Humans would have to come together to form their own hyper object to defeat another hyper object because humans are only objects, not hyper objects.
yeah, to my understanding, the like to go up against a hyper object is to essentially go up against a concept itself. You need another concept to counter another concept.
Not
It,
necessarily. What I'm
it
saying is that because of its non-locality, it's impossible to fight it as one person because you can't be in two places at once, essentially.
Yeah, you would need
you won't live
you need
forever.
an entire society to fight it.
You need an entire planet. You would
Yeah.
have to create a hyper object of all the humans on Earth to fight it, or at least a majority of the humans on Earth, minus the rogue elements that will obviously appear in all forms of humanity. There will always be rogue elements in every concept.
So, okay, let me, I guess, play a little bit of devil's advocate for a second.
Go ahead.
Would technically a movement on a planet be considered a hyper object? Like, I'll just use something right out of thin air, like Black Lives Matter, just as an example.
I'm going to redirect your example to something that has already been spoken about in this article as a
Okay.
counter to another hyperobject. Global warming is a hyperobject.
Mm-hmm.
The movement towards green policies is another hyperobject. They're hyperobjects that combat each other.
Okay.
There's your example.
Gotcha.
Black Lives Matter technically also is a hyperobject that counters another hyperobject, which is race relations. But that hyperobject is so complex, I don't want to talk about it.
That's fair.
It's deeply entwined with politics. Fuck English. It's intertwined with politics, and I don't like politics at all. I am what would be called politically apathetic. I don't like talking about politics in any case, any way, any form. I don't.
That's fair. I wasn't in trying to instill politics into the discussion. I was just simply pulling, like, can movements be considered
Yes.
a hyper object as well?
Movements are the best example of hyperobjects, actually, because of how pervasive and spatially temporal they are.
Because
They can
it's an
over
idea.
time. Yeah, they can exist over time through, especially with the age of the internet, in small pockets all over the world, and not be like. It's not like, say, for example, like the U.S. Army. It has a chain of command. It exists for a long time. It's non-spatial. However, it can be destroyed. Most hyperobjects can't actually be really destroyed. They can be suppressed. They can turn into dark objects, but they aren't going to be destroyed. That's the best way I can point it out. The only way to destroy them is to destroy both hyperobjects, because all hyperobjects probably, from my own understanding of the nature of the universe, if a hyperobject exists, it implies another hyperobject that goes against its own existence. So if there's a hyperobject that is pro one thing, it implies the existence of a hyperobject that goes against that same hyperobject.
Yeah, because you
Because
can't
all
destroy
things
them.
require opposing force. Yeah,
they
all
apply
things
opposing
require
force.
forces.
Yeah. Everything has an equal or opposite reaction to it.
No, that's Newtonian, and that's not what I'm referring to.
Oh.
It's not an equal and opposite reaction. It's literally everything. The concept of good implies the concept of evil. The concept of up implies the concept of down. So, if one exists, the other must exist. If one is destroyed, the other doesn't exist either.
So more of the concept of duality, then.
That is literally the concept of duality. That's exactly what duality is.
Gotcha.
Basically, the only thing left once you destroy one of them is for neither to exist, and there to not be anything.
Yeah, so hyperobjects is simply, of course, cannot be destroyed. They can only either be negated or eclipsed.
Yes, that's exactly what would be going on. Either they would be halted in such a way that, because neither hyperobject would gain any ground, they would essentially not exist, or the hyperobject would become so small compared to another hyperobject that it would be eclipsed by that other hyperobject and act as if it didn't exist.
Gotcha.
However, that hyperobject still is there. It just hasn't. It's just not doing anything.
Yeah.
Also, I see whiteheads in here. Why is he referenced? Let's see.
Whiteheads? Question mark?
Alfred North Whitehead. He's a very famous philosopher, at least from the. He goes more into the psychedelic philosophers. So Alfred North Whitehead, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Alan Watts, Terence McKenna. Some of those aren't necessarily psychedelic, but their concepts are psychedelic influence to some degree.
Their realm of reasoning is where it stems from, more or less.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that there are certain concepts that come out of the psychedelic domain. The psychedelic domain actually in of itself is a hyperobject. It's actually a very massive hyperobject. It's probably one of the biggest ones that exist, besides maybe human culture as its own thing in of its entirety, from the very past to the very present and the very future of human culture. That's probably the only thing that's bigger than the psychedelic realm. But there are certain concepts in the psychedelic hyperobject that when they manifest outside of it, for those who have spent a lot of time with that hyperobject, can point it out and say that's a psychedelic concept. That's not a rational thought concept.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because it requires a certain leap in logic or a certain form of intuition that cannot be facilitated unless one has been exposed to the psychedelic hyperobject.
Basically, again, the viscous property comes into play.
Yes, it's a concept that is stuck in its entirety to the hyperobject of psychedelia, and if you don't touch that object, you can't use that concept. But once you found that concept, if you have been exposed to psychedelia and you have touched that hyperobject, you will recognize it as another part of that hyperobject. But if you haven't, you'll just see it as some kind of crazy concept along with every other crazy concept that exists out there. Because there are some crazy concepts that are psychedelia induced specifically, and there are some crazy concepts that are just madness. And they have nothing to do with psychedelia. But if you haven't touched the psychedelic hyperobject, you can't tell the difference.
Gotcha.
Like, for example, which is kind of related to this, is Terence McKenna's philosophy. He says that he believes that in a time wave theory, which for most people would just seem crazy, the theory of the time wave. However, it comes directly from that psychedelic hyperobject. And he actually talks about a concept which I don't think he is aware of, the concept of hyperobjects, which I will actually double check right now by looking up this article, because if this, let's see. Oh yeah, no, he's never heard of hyperobjects. Specifically because this book, The Ecological Thought Where Hyperobjects Are Introduced, came out in 2010, April 30th of 2010.
So it's still a relatively new concept.
Well, what's more important than that, let me just double check my facts here, is that Terence McKenna died April 3rd of 2000. So Terence McKenna's never heard of the concept of a hyperobject.
Yeah.
And so, but he refers to in his philosophy of that at the end of this time wave, which is a prediction of temporal events, there will be what he calls the hyperdimensional object at the end of history. That's what he got from psychedelia. That's one of his things. That's what he got from it. He is most well known for this is like Terence McKenna's like magnum opus. he and his brother came up with this, which is called the stoned ape theory. Now, I'm sure you've heard of what's called the drunk ape theory, right?
I think I've heard of it in passing, but I've never really explored it myself.
So the idea is basically we grew grains and stuff. We became agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
And then we basically learned about beer and wine on accident, and that's what made us develop culture. So we developed
Okay.
all the systems of writing and stuff, and this is the drunk ape theory. However, there is a counter theory called the stoned ape theory, which is by Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna, his brother. And that he says how did the question he proposes is how did the human brain triple in size in just 2 million years when for the past millions of years it didn't change whatsoever. It was basically the same size, and all of a sudden in a span of just 2 million years, which in terms of evolution is actually a very short span of time. 2 million
Yeah,
years
that's
short.
really fast.
Like things normally take like tripling a brain size might take hundreds of millions normally for an increase of that size.
Yeah, and we did it in a fraction.
Yeah. And so he wonders about this, and according to his theory, the Stone Ape theory, a community of proto-humans might have consumed magic mushrooms they found in the wild, and that was what that their consumption of them basically allowed them through a bunch of different things, because it's a very long theory actually. It includes the fact that small doses of magic mushrooms increase eyesight acuity, allowing them to be better hunters. And then medium doses can act as an aphrodisiac, allowing them to mate more rapidly and more often. And that high doses give religious experiences, founding religions. And that those three factors, combined with the fact that he believes that magic mushrooms have a consciousness expanding property in the sense that they allow it, we already know they increase neuroplasticity, which is the ability for your brain to adapt and grow new cells.
Mm-hmm.
And that they would have been very easy to accidentally find. Basically, that this is before we even this is back when we were nomad hunters. We would follow the animals as they went, and magic mushrooms grow in animal feces. They grow in their dung.
Yeah,
especially in like cow or buffalo. And that we, during that period, because we were hungry and we're trying to find these guys, at some point picked the mushrooms out of it and ate them, learned that they of these magic mushrooms, and continued to cultivate them and consume them throughout the years.
So what you're saying is stoners would have possibly started mankind.
In a sense, it started human culture.
Yeah.
But he says that they essentially, his concept is that we dove into the concept of history, which is the idea of written records and all this whole concept of recording our pasts, essentially. Mm-hmm. Which, in all honesty, we actually can't do properly. There's no way to actually fully do it. As they say, history is written by the victor.
True.
So we never actually know what's happened. We just know a certain concept of it. And
a certain perspective. For the very least.
He says that at a certain point, we will exit history. And when we exit history, we will encounter a hyperdimensional object as we do so. And I don't know what this hyperdimensional object is, but that's a conversation for another time. It is currently 9 o'clock.
Yep, we are coming up on time.
We will resume this conversation in this topic next episode, where during the following week we will discuss on our own times what anything that we have and do some more research and come back to this. But hyperobjects are what I want to talk about for the next couple days, and we will talk about other things, including stuff from that other video. So for now, that's Knox signing out.
All right.
Throw it to you, Axel.
Yep, it was good talking to you, brother. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that'll be this week's episode from Cocktails and Curiosities. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast as much as we did, talking about some really crazy stuff. Hyperobjects, ontology, both by Dr. Bryant and Dr. Morton. Both of these going into very out there theories that I'm still to this day kind of trying to wrap my head around. But next week we'll be going a little bit more in depth with this, and I might actually have us talk about the concept of reasoning and the how our species has evolved in our ideas of reasoning and reality. And we'll kind of put together a list about that, how to talk about that in a more concise manner. But that's gonna be it for this week. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to keep in contact with me and Knox and give us ideas for our next following up podcast, feel free to give us a poke either on Twitter. Twitter's probably the easiest way to get in contact with us in case you have any thoughts, ideas, concerns, criticisms. And you can also leave a comment down in the YouTube section below as well. I do look over those every day. I do try to keep up those as best as I can, and I will get back to you when I am able to on those comments. Additionally, I do stream every weekday around 12 p.m. to about 5 p.m. Schedule's been kind of weird the last couple of days because I've been doing a bunch of errands and making sure we're good for the next couple of months. But of course, I have a Twitch channel that I do stream on. Play a couple things such as BDO right now is a big one, or Call of Duty, or even I've been playing some Titanfall in there as well. That's gonna be it from us. Again, hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next week on another episode of Cocktails and